Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the media and fellow South Africans that are watching us. You would recall that the President said GCIS budget is cut, you see. Can you hear now? No. Hello? 1, 2, 3, no. Okay, then we have to move. The mics, what are we going to do? Can I just stand and talk? No. Okay? Can hear.
Can you try this mic? Maybe?
Hear me now? Is that better? Okay, move a bit to your right. Now you can just leave all this as it is. That's fine. Okay, so once again, good afternoon and welcome. Let me get straight into the substance. The President said almost a year ago that Eskom is absolutely vital to our economy, for businesses, but also for our households, and very central to ensuring that our economy can grow inclusively, but at a higher pace than we have currently. He also said that Eskom is too big to fail, meaning that we cannot allow an important entity which is responsible for some 95% of the energy provision or electricity provision in South Africa to fall into difficulties that would harm the country's economy and our future and future generations as well. He also said that the government will take responsibility to get Eskom out of its situation, both in an operational sense, but also in a financial sense, and pointed out to South Africans at the time that Eskom will not be able to trade its way out of its financial troubles. By that he meant that if it carried on in the normal way, it will not be making enough money to cover the costs that it incurs. So one of the biggest problems in Eskom has been the fact that its cost structure is much higher than the revenue it is making from the sales of electricity. He said in that speech as well that a new business model is required. Subsequently, earlier this year, he said that we would provide as government a roadmap for Eskom's future, which points out, firstly, where are we taking Eskom into the next 5, 10, 15 years and more, and you'll understand why I say this in a moment. Secondly, why are we moving in that direction? And thirdly, how are we going to go about actually doing it? So our paper that we are releasing today and the presentation we're going to make to you shortly is about answering those questions in as frank a way as we can. I want to repeat that energy is absolutely economy, and certainly we've had experiences in the past in South Africa where energy in the 2009-10 period, or the lack thereof, has been a constraint on the economy and can deprive our economy of 1% or slightly more in terms of the growth numbers that we are capable of in our country. But secondly, energy just doesn't operate on its own. It operates in a context where there are thousands of workers in the mines, particularly the coal mines of South Africa. There are thousands of workers in the power stations that Eskom owns and operates. And together with these workers are communities in the mining areas and in the power station areas who must also be looked after as we transition and the world transitions to a different kind of future. And so when we talk about a just transition, we're talking about how the manner in which we generate electricity is changing across the globe. Generally, there's a movement away from fossil fuels. Generally, there's a movement away from carbon emissions of the order that we see in South Africa. And there's a move towards clean energy in one form or another, and an emphasis amongst other sources of energy on renewables as well. So we'll introduce to you the concept of a just transition and what that means in the energy context, in the context of workers, and in the context of communities where power stations and mines actually operate. Several government departments have collaborated in formulating this paper: the National Treasury, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, the Department of Environment, the Eskom board, and many of the skilled professionals within Eskom itself have provided invaluable help, and we've received all sorts of advice. The future of Eskom. But in saying that, there's a belief among South Africans and in your own constituency as the media that fixing Eskom means just replacing a tire in a car or replacing a bolt in a boiler. What we're learning from experience is a long, protracted process, which has to be undertaken with discipline. It needs to be undertaken with a clear sense of vision about where we want to go as far as the energy industry in South Africa is concerned. And it must be done in a way in which we have capable people to execute the plans that we are actually talking about. One example that we've come to Vietnam, which has kind of equivalence with South Africa in terms of the amount of energy that the economy requires, which is between 42 and 45,000 gigawatts, which is similar to ours, is that they started the process very slowly in the 1970s, gathered a lot more steam in the 1990s, but eventually it took about 20 years to get to where they wanted to get. So there are some things that will happen fairly rapidly. There are other things that need to happen in a slow, systematic, and disciplined way in order to meet the requirements of the day. So what does the paper say? So in the first instance, I want to repeat that this is the beginning of a process. This isn't the entirety of a process. This is about placing Eskom, as far as government is concerned, and this is not Gordhan's plan or anything like that, although many of you like to personalize it. It's a collaborative effort within government to take a entity and reposition it. There's lots of ifs and buts, there's lots of details to be worked on, but what we are clear is that Eskom can't remain as it is. But the point I want to emphasize is that these things will take time, and this process of change will require the participation of all stakeholders to actually accomplish. So in the first instance, we say that the Eskom journey into the future is dependent on the integrated resource plan that Minister Mantashe Cabinet about 10 days or so. And this plan indicates the kind of energy mix that South Africa foresees for itself for the next 10 years. In other words, how much of hydro or nuclear mix in South Africa, and how that mix will time as we go through this journey over the next decade or so. The second thing that this paper points out is how the transmission component will be separated, firstly as a functional subsidiary of Eskom Holdings. And so I want to emphasize that the next two things I'm going to talk about, transmission and generation, happens in a context where Eskom remains as a holding company, and these will be subsidiaries under Eskom Holdings. And I'll take you through some of the details just now in the PowerPoint slide, but let me go through this narrative quickly for you. So transmission will be separated, and what does transmission do? Transmission, people who work, the 5,000 or 6,000 people who work in this area, are responsible for conducting electricity from power stations to where they're required throughout South Africa. So they have, some 45,000 kilometers or something of wires, and those are wires that you see overhead. Some of those wires you'll see within a municipal boundary, others you will see in different parts of the country. And those wires are quite important. If you watch the fires that are taking place in California at the moment, it is these wires that are being managed and the electricity that passes through them by what is called the systems operator to make sure that sparks that come out of the transmission wires don't cause more fires. So those of you that are watching what's happening in California have a picture of how important this transmission component is. So firstly, it's looking after this infrastructure in transmission. Secondly, it's a systems operator. This is the team that is demanded at any point in time and how much of power is available from the different generation sources that energy is produced in. Thirdly, it has and will have a buying component, and this buying component will from day to day decide how much of energy does it want to, inverted commas, buy from Eskom generation, how much of energy is it taking from renewables that are currently in existence or will be in existence in the future, or from time to time, if it wants to buy power from the private sector, at what price would it actually buy it as well. So there's a buying function. And we'll show you some diagrams that will illustrate this to you as we distribute the PowerPoint to you. So there's a fair amount of detail available about how that separation process will occur, and we hope that by January or so next year, some of the physical will already have been made, and our ultimate deadline for, let's call it the So that's the first component. The second component is currently powered stations, nuclear power through Koeberg, buys power from Cahora Bassa in the form of hydro, and it has various pump stations and peaking plants and other facilities available to it from which it actually gets power. But what it lacks as a monopoly is competition. And as a result of the lack of competition, we do not get the most effective pricing coming out of the generation side. So a proposal that will come back to some of the other elements of generation. So let's say there are 5 or 4 power stations in each cluster. Each cluster is a business, and that business must produce power as cost effectively as possible so that you as consumers or businesses as consumers get the lowest possible price that is available from the Eskom generation entities. But more importantly, this will set up internal competition within the Eskom-owned generating facilities that we actually have at different power stations. Experiences in Vietnam and in other parts of the world have shown competition is good for business, so to speak. It's good for the consumer, and it gets greater efficiencies into the generating process as well. Eskom will also participate in developing renewable, and I'll come back to this in a moment in a different kind of context, and there'll be other generators or types of generation happening. So one example that we might or might not be aware of is so-called embedded generation that is taking place in municipalities. And here what we have is energy generated through biomass or rooftop solar, but which don't necessarily enter the transmission grid of Eskom itself, but is locally utilized in whatever way it has been designed at a local level. So what we've covered are 3 things. Firstly, the IRP as the energy basis. Secondly, the separation and creation of the transmission entity. And thirdly, the creation of competition through the creation of these clusters within the generation component, and in particular, Eskom's participation in renewables as well. The fourth area that we're looking at is the current environment. And here, again, we do require the understanding of the media as a constituency, but the public as well, that the kind of damage capture cause within Eskom is huge. That this is not just about somebody who stole a few billion rands and ran off to whichever island they currently are in. But the damage is systemic. And once that damage is systemic, in other words, corruption can not just happen with a few individuals, a string of individuals in a hierarchy that will take whatever opportunity they get in order to steal money from Eskom through procurement and other processes. But secondly, skilled people were chased out of Eskom, particularly black professionals. And thirdly, that began to harm the operations of Eskom itself. And fourthly, as a consequence, you had the impact, the negative impact on the finances of Eskom. So you have a rolling effect from the kind of state capture process into operations and into the finances of Eskom as well. We can't blame so-called state capture for everything because there were other errors made as well. For example, in the design of the bigger plants at Medupi and Kusile, but we want to deal with that separately and we'll come back to the public with a more comprehensive document on our findings in that particular regard. So, the key in the is to improve the current generation of energy, make it a lot more efficient. For those of you that are familiar with the energy availability factor, that is how much of energy is each plant capable of producing. The optimum, obviously, or the maximum is 100%. Many of the power stations in Eskom and the units within those power stations, the 69 to 71% zone. And what we require is for that 71% to become at least 80% sooner rather than later in order to get the right kind of in the generation component. And it is in this regard that we often find Eskom on the margin, so to speak, as far as generating energy is concerned, because it doesn't have the buffer that is required in order to create safety for itself. The second area is the financial area. And here we believe that in addition to the cost savings that Eskom talked about in the past of some 33 billion rands over a period of time, a new effort must be made to get more cost savings. So you know that Minister Mantashe, Mr. Minister Patel and myself have met the coal producers. You also know that we've identified, I don't know the names of these entities, but there are 7 companies that are making more than 100% profit on selling coal to Eskom. The dialogue that we've started must result in a reasonable profit for the mining community and the producer applied to Eskom on the other hand. We believe that this being one of the big cost items in Eskom, there could be substantial savings that the mining community must make a contribution to for the survival of this entity. Similarly, in diesel, in terms of the cost of the first 3 rounds of renewable, original equipment manufacturers. And there's been malfeasance, result of which it has a negative impact on the cost structure. The kind of support that government through the Treasury has offered to Eskom, including the announcement by Minister Mboweni earlier in the year of 23 billion rands per year over a 10-year period, and the current special appropriation bill that is before Parliament. I'm not going to indicate to you what he's going to say because I don't know tomorrow, but he might make further pronouncements in this regard tomorrow. But the big issue that many of us would be concerned with is what's happening to this 450 to 500 billion rands worth of debt. And here it's fairly clear that debt cannot be dealt with in its own right. What the marketplace wants to see and investors that have lent money to Eskom want to see and to government as a whole is that we have a plan for the future of Eskom in terms of a new business model. Secondly, a plan to get more efficient and cost-effective operations going. Thirdly, that we are undertaking cost savings of the type that I've actually spelled out. And we'll have to look at a process by which engagement with lenders take place, and we'll keep you informed as and when that actually happens. The next area is the just transition area that I indicated earlier on. And here we talk about the minimum emission standards that have to be complied with. At the moment, if there's retrofitting of clean coal technology, it's going to cost somewhere between 170 and 200 billion rands, which we don't have. But Eskom process of incrementally beginning to install some of this technology and other measures needed in order to meet these minimum emission standards. Secondly, I've indicated to you the kind of energy transition that is happening globally, but also as reflected in the integrated resource plan. And South Africa over the next 10 or 20 years will be a witness to and experience the change in energy supplies and the mix of energy supplies as we actually go forward. Thirdly, as I pointed out earlier as well, as we talk about decommissioning power stations, the older ones that are 50 and 55 years old, there's some research being done elsewhere in the world that we've come across about alternate uses of the infrastructure in many of those areas, including usage for battery storage, usage for installing renewable plants in close proximity, and utilizing the transmission parks and so on is not available. So there's some area of innovation that our own research institutes are doing, but people are doing elsewhere in the world. But the key point is that together with labor and the mining community, we want to start a pilot project in one of these areas so that we understand what a just transition for workers and communities actually mean in practice. And once we get that going, we'll learn a lot of lessons about how to ensure that workers are reskilled, are redeployed, new kinds of opportunities for jobs are created within the renewables and other areas, including in the battery storage area, and how communities can also, in terms of the enterprises that they have within those communities, survive any changes that take place in this context as well. Finally, the paper looks at the implementation question. All these ideas are fine. What are you going to do with them? So we've got a plan for the next 2 months and then for the next year, and a broad idea of what follows in the years ahead after that. So there's a clear implementation plan. An implementation machinery would be created and a leader for that machinery within Eskom itself. A monitoring entity will be created within the Department of Public Enterprises that will monitor the implementation and progress that we actually make, so that these are not just promises and ideas that we are putting forward. Real change must actually happen on the ground and must happen in the way in which the planning actually takes place. Now, there are some questions that you're going to ask that I'm going to anticipate. The first is the question of the board has completed its work. It has made its recommendations. We're now going through a government process, and hopefully next week government will be able to announce the new CEO of Eskom Holdings. Secondly, there will be some changes to the board, both in terms of filling vacancies, but also bringing in a set of skills that are appropriate to the next 3-year cycle that Eskom has to go through. A cycle in which there will be structural changes and challenges, and where change management becomes a crucial element, together with the kind of skills that are going to be required in this environment as well. Thirdly, the transmission entity itself will have an interim board of 3 or 5 people whose task it will be to drive the process of change and the establishment of the transmission entity, and that hopefully we will announce in the next week or so as well. As far as the debt issue is concerned, Minister Mboweni will give further pronouncements on that tomorrow. And what you might find interesting, which we found interesting, is there's a interesting corollary with Pemex. Pemex is the energy or oil SOE, so to speak, in Mexico. And Pemex found itself in a very similar situation to Eskom. So there's some interesting lessons from Pemex for South Africa as we deal with this particular issue as well. On the question of municipal debt, the President has made it clear, as has government and the governing party, that non-payment and non-compliance with one's obligations is not acceptable, and that all of us as South Africans need to participate. We are in due course, structures of government, to get some kind of campaign going, which will start encouraging people to pay or face the consequences of not paying, particularly where they can afford to pay as well. Finally, before I take you quickly through the presentation, a message to the board and the staff of Eskom. This has been a very difficult period for them. And I believe that the vast majority of the 40-odd thousand people that work in Eskom are honest people. They are dedicated to making that entity work, and they are dedicated to ensuring that the country succeeds. I had a brief interaction with the board just before I got here and gave a similar message to them as well. So we are grateful for the work that they do, but all of us need to cooperate, including the staff, to make sure that we can make this new journey that Eskom has to undertake a successful one and give it the full commitment that we actually require. Now, let me just take you through a few slides. I won't take you through all of them. You'll have access to all of them, and then explain some of those things to you. Let me just manage. Oops, this technology. So,
on the screen.
all right, this slide really gives you the rationale for why we need to begin to have a new roadmap for Eskom and a new business model, which I've spelled out to you to some extent. The next slide is some of the reasons that are motivating us, as I pointed out earlier on, to take Eskom in a new direction, including the risk that we carry as a country, where 95% of our energy comes from one source. And that means that we have all our eggs, so to speak, in one basket, and that creates its own risk for the economy and for the people of South Africa as well. And clearly, Eskom is a large entity to manage, but more importantly, there's no cost transparency. So ideally, we want to move to a position where every power station manager not only understands how much of coal is required and which repairs are required to be undertaken, but understands the profit and loss statement for that power station and whether they are operating that power station in a cost-effective way. We'll get there sooner rather than later, but also we want to remove the moral hazard. And by moral hazard, we mean that once you know that government will back anything you do, and whenever you get into financial difficulties, it means you can spend money as you like. This happened in the 2008-2009 financial crisis in the US. The banks knew they could get fancy footwork, which cost billions of rands, but also impacted on the global economy. And their banks and their banking system. So we don't want to be in a similar situation. We need to remove Eskom from that kind of dynamic as we go into the future. The Eskom of the future, as we said, those pages are all mixed, is the one that I've spelled out to you, the three subsidiaries in generation, transmission, and distribution. Let me focus on distribution at this point in time because of the complexities of municipalities earning a fair amount of their revenue from electricity sales and the premium that they make on the sales. So there's a bit more study that we need to do and interact with the various stakeholders on the municipal front forward as far as municipal distribution is concerned, and we'll come back to how we then manage Eskom distribution in this kind of context. So that's Eskom of the future. The operational problems, I indicated to you the urgency of getting generation onto the right kind of footing. We need to keep the breakdowns in Eskom below 9,500 megawatts, and even that is too high. So we are basically saying we have the potential to generate 45,000 megawatts, but at any point in time, we have anything between 10,000 and 13,000 megawatts out of action. And that's not an efficient way to run a big operation like Eskom. And we might be looking with our partners in mineral resource and energy, for 2,000 megawatts of additional power to give us the buffer whilst the long-term maintenance of some of these plants can actually take place. This is a simple diagram which would help you to understand particularly for members of the public, what we are talking about when we talk about the different components of Eskom. So on your left is electricity generation. Those are the power stations. And those power stations produce and sell energy in the future to electricity transmission. That's the transmission component that I spoke about. And when we have generation, that's the bottom that you actually see. Transmission will then sell electricity to distribution, which will then sell electricity to the final consumer. But the distributor at the moment in South Africa is both municipalities and Eskom itself. So this is a way of how the buying and the selling process will work. And if you look at the top arrow, that's how the flow of electricity takes place. But equally important is the bottom arrow. Whilst electricity is supplied and sold at the top, money must actually come back into the system. We're familiar with the challenges that Eskom faces, so we don't have to get into that. The next is the integrated resource plan that I referred to, and the various mixes that we have as far as energy is concerned. This is what the transmission component will actually look like. Eskom generation, the independent power producers, both renewables and independent coal producers. SAPP refers to not the software system, it refers to the South African power pool of which South Africa is a part. We both supply energy into this pool but also get energy from it. We have peaking plants as well that I referred to earlier on. And on the right-hand side are the distributors or the consumers of energy. In the middle is the systems operator, the person or persons who decide what is the demand for energy at any particular point in time. On the left will be the buyers from the generation side. At the bottom on the middle is the management of the grid, so that the grid wires are in good shape throughout their existence. And then you need a supply agreement on the right-hand side of the box to the consumers of energy. If you're looking at the key functions within the transmission entity, here's some details, and we're not going to go through that. The next slide indicates to you the kind of detailed work that is being done at the three different levels in order to get the restructuring process off the ground, and there's a lot of detail that sits behind it. If you want proof that we are working on it, I tell you in as well. Side. Carry on. This one. So those are on the left-hand side the three clusters that I spoke about of power stations that will compete with one another and create this greater efficiency that we are actually talking about. And on the right-hand side are the various, if you like, support functions, including the supply of primary energy to generation as well. I'm trying to synchronize this with my colleague here. The restructuring of Eskom has those benefits of increasing transparency, particularly in respect of costs, driving and making sure our aim must be that the supply of energy must be ahead of economic growth, just about on economic growth in any kind of way. And it will take some effort to actually get there. To get competition in generation, like I pointed out earlier on, and have a stable system, both in generation and transmission. And a lot more investment needs to take place by municipalities in the reticulation of electricity at a local level as well. Then we're looking at the financial components. There are various, that's okay, let's move. So I spoke about the reviewing of the coal contracts, the new procurement approach that we will engage in, reviewing of the IPP contracts so that we have a mutually beneficial outcome both for those that have installed renewables and ourselves and Eskom. Disposal of non-core assets. So for example, we have Eskom finance company that's worth something like 6 or 7 billion rands. We will start the process of disposing of that so that that cash can be utilized within Eskom itself. And we then look at employees and what kind of savings we can get there. But the key here is that labor will become a partner in this process and look at various options outside of retrenchments as we get into this process. Collection of the municipal debt is the next item. You cannot talk about cost-reflective tariffs for Eskom if the cost structure remains intact and is an extravagant one. Narrow down the extravagance in the cost structure, if you like, and the excesses in the cost structure. So when we talk about cost-reflective tariffs, if you have a good dream, remaining exactly where they are. The just transition is then explained in the slides that actually follow. And then we look at the implementation plan. So there's a broad idea in the slide of what some of the objectives for different phases are. The next slide gives you the kind of implementation structures and monitoring structures that we will actually set up. And tomorrow morning, we then start with the process of implementing some of the things that we are actually talking about. So let me stop here, ladies and gentlemen, and summarize as follows. Eskom cannot remain as it is. Energy is absolutely crucial to this economy and to the households in South Africa. And we have to have a reliable source of energy for South Africans, whether they are in business or in households or students who are studying for their exams, for example. Thirdly, we have to resolve the operational issues. At the same time, we need to shift towards the new business model and create the transmission entity, generation clusters as we are talking about them, within Eskom itself, whilst looking at the question of a new leadership within Eskom and a resolution to the debt issues, which my colleague, the Minister of Finance, will address as we go forward. I'm optimistic that this is all possible, and what it requires is for all the different stakeholders that are connected to Eskom in one way or another, whether you are a coal supplier or a technology supplier, or working within Eskom or other interested parties, all of us will have to make a contribution for this project to succeed. And I'm sure that if we get that kind of goodwill, we will succeed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minister. I'm going to take 3 questions now. Victoria, please, colleagues, mention your name and your publication and just keep it to 1 question because we are running out of time. I see Alex, number 2, number 3. Alex, you can start. There's a mic there, Alex.
Thank you. I understand that the Minister of Finance will make some announcements tomorrow, but could you give an approximate time frame for the sorts of engagements that you're talking about with lenders? You know, should we be, thinking in terms of years? Should we be thinking in terms of months? These hadn't started. Thank you.
Okay, I think Terence.
Terence, Creamer Engineering. The deadline for the clusters that you're going to set up in generation, is it a similar deadline to the end of March next year? How will those be composed? And is there any scope for
A
private?
little bit louder, Terence, please.
How will those so how will those clusters be composed? Because you've got some very old plant, you've got some new plant, you've got some plant that are next to private sector participation in the cluster. And just one point of interest, integrated resource plan, which is talking about 80% anymore, but closer to the 70%, which is why they need the 3,000 megawatts of emergency power. Thanks.
Mention your name and your publication,
Charlotte
please, guys.
Matthews from Mining MX. Could
Okay,
you
you'll come
explain
after.
how new mega power generation
Next
will occur in this system? I'm talking about stuff that will cost billions of rands, because there won't be a guaranteed offtake agreement and there won't be a government guarantee. So where would you get at this kind of thing?
Understand that we didn't get.
We can hear you. Just speak slowly.
Slowly,
so we
yeah.
can catch what you're saying.
Okay. It's Charlotte Matthews from Mining MX. where would new mega generation come from? The kind of projects that cost billions of rands, because there will be no guaranteed offtake agreement and there won't be a government guarantee. So how will this kind of thing be financed?
Okay, I'll come for the second one, Minister.
So let's carry on.
Okay, you can go.
It's Sikonati Manchanja.
Sikonati is not allowed to ask questions.
Mr. Gordhan, just on the question of power station clusters, where is the competition supposed to come from if you just clustered power stations together? What exactly is that meant to achieve? It's related to, well, in addition to Terrence's question, the ownership. What is it that will change about those stations that will suddenly make them competitive? And you're very careful to not give any concrete steps to be taken against non-paying electricity consumers. Can you help us there? I'm sure you can get 17 billion rand immediately if you got everybody to pay. And lastly, Labour, the National Union of Mine Workers said it's marching to the ANC's offices. Presumably, they were preempting the announcement we're going to make today. Are you talking to them step by step about this process or not? Thank you.
Thanks, Sikonati. Cape Town? Lisa?
Yes, we've got six. Yes, we've got 7 questions now, but we'll go with the first.
Can you limit
So
it
please.
to about 4?
Okay, we'll do the first 4 and then
Yes,
we'll come
please.
back.
Thank
So
you.
it's Paul on that side first. Yeah. Christine,
Okay,
and
you
then-
can go.
Minister Paul Vecchiarch from Bloomberg. The restructuring of Eskom, will that mean a change to the Eskom Governing Act? And if so, when do you expect that draft to be completed?
Lange from Report. Janne Lange from Report newspaper. On what criteria will you use to split the generation plants, the present coal-fired plants, into 3 divisions? Will it be age? Will it be generation capacity? On what criteria? How are you going to split them into 3 divisions? Secondly, you say that regarding the non-payment culture of municipalities. Municipalities in rural areas are to a significant degree collapsing. On Friday, for instance, the Harry Smith Business Chamber agreed with Eskom, Maluti Apufong municipality. This is the alternative for the strategy is industrialization in rural areas. How are you going to fix that? The plan that you're putting before us is a 5-year at least. Can you maybe comment on that?
Next question, Jezal.
We're just struggling here with our mics. One moment, please.
Okay, I'll go so long while Carol is finding a mic that works. Jan Newberg from Marula Media. A few questions. Firstly, I want to reiterate one of the questions that has been asked because it's key, and that is union buy-in. Secondly, this is a special paper. Where does it stand vis-a-vis a white paper? What is the meaning of special paper? Thirdly, we've seen the amounts that are owed in the different provinces. In total, we're looking at 25 billion at the moment, of which only 5 million is owed in the Western Cape because power is cut. It speaks to the point of sanction. At what point will government actually realize that half of the amount is owed by Soweto and that nothing is ever cut from there, so therefore why pay? And then finally, do you see the NUM-NUMSA rivalry as a proxy for COSATU-SAFTU rivalry, and how will you deal with that?
Hi, it's Carol Payton from Business Day. Firstly, on the competition and generation, I mean, when and how does that kick in? At the moment, you have set PPAs that you have with renewable producers. Would they be excluded from that competition? Would it just be your coal stations competing? And how do they actually set a price? How does that actually work? And is the Eskom in a position to actually not take because of the energy shortage? So the kind of competition idea could be dead in the water. The second thing, the ITSMO. I mean, the ITSMO. The ITSMO. How long? What's your sort of time frame for that? And how Eskom Holdings, even when you've got what you call the legal separation, it still remains part of Eskom Holdings in this diagram, and it still remains reporting to DPE. I mean, how do you actually guarantee the actual independence? And then, sorry, lastly, when do you actually have to do that debt split? Do you have to do it at the moment that you set up the legal separation, or when do you think you have to do it? And do you feel that you have to offer all your debt holders pari passu principle? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Giselle. Minister.
It's a very good set of questions, so thank you for that. But I think, let me provide some context into which some of the things will fit in. Firstly, we've got a deal, I think it was Jan Jano, one of the Cape Town colleagues, who said, we have a crisis now, but this is about 5 years. Well, I think that what we are saying here is that we can't just deal with the crisis without making major shifts in the business model. So we've got to undertake change in the business model and at the same time deal with the crises so that both of those begin to, in the next few years, so the result that we actually have a stable electricity supplier in South Africa. So the change process, management process needs to work together. Don't see it as separate processes. The one will actually reinforce the other in one way or another. But crucial to any change process, and this is where some of the questions that you are raising can't just be answered just yet, is the sequencing of the change. So you can't just ordain change. You've got to work out exactly what kind of sequencing is involved. On the transmission side, we've got some of that sequencing worked out in detail. On the generation side, we are floating this idea. Its feasibility needs to be tested. But if we agree on the key principle, and the key principle is consumers in South Africa are entitled to the most cost-effective tariffs that Eskom or any other energy provider is able to provide. That's the key, that you want cost-effective electricity. In the past, in the apartheid era and slightly thereafter, South Africa became a destination for some industrial development and investment because of the cheap electricity, which was not sustainable over a period of time. But now we've moved into a period where over the last 10 years, as you know, we're selling the same amount of electricity in megawatts. In fact, demand is dropping at the rate of 1% at the tariffs have gone up 5 times, 500% over that period. That's not sustainable for the economy. So when we hear the manufacturing sector or the mining sector saying more generally, and where we have a commitment in the NDP to lowering the cost of business but also lowering the cost of living, then we have an obligation to undertake both the crisis management and the change and sequence these things together with the financial solutions in a way in which we get the kind of end result that we look for, which is cost-effective electricity, energy security, diverse sources of energy in line with the IRP, and a sustainable institutional structure as we go forward. Because that's the vision, if you like, that would actually drive us. So if we're talking about the debt issue that some of you have actually raised, the timeframes can't be a couple of years. It has to be sooner than that. But once the Treasury is ready to communicate that, they will certainly do that in a short while. Will the pari passu apply? And for those of us that are not familiar with that language, that's Latin, which I failed a few times in high school. It means you've got to treat all of your debt holders or your lenders on the same basis, right? And that's a key principle that the financial sector actually adopts for itself in dealing with these issues, so it has to apply. But again, let the people who are responsible in the final instance for this come back. All the questions in relation to the clusters. What will be the criteria? How will it happen? How will the PPAs operate? Again, the fundamental issue we are saying is that monopolies by their nature are wasteful. Monopolies by their costs. Monopolies by their nature are self-interested. They don't look outside of themselves. So we've got to change the monopoly culture and the monopoly pricing, whether it's in the private sector or in the public sector, by the way. Monopoly pricing is generally extractive pricing. So how do we get competition going in a way in which Mr. Yelland is a purchaser of electricity? They have options. Now that currently operates in China, it currently operates in Vietnam, it currently operates in other situations as well. But it doesn't happen tomorrow morning. These are, you have to first put in both the legal instruments, the contractual instruments, and the institutional instruments in place, and that's where the sequencing comes in order for this proposition to actually work. But what we should agree is that we want sustainable energy at the lowest possible cost in order to support both our economy and the cost of living scenario in South Africa. So to you on the criteria, I think there were periods when EAF reached higher. So our target for Eskom must be higher than 70%, because that shows a more productive use of plant at the end of the day as we go forward. Non-payment is another issue. The concrete steps, hands of Eskom, they're actually in the hands of municipalities. So what we are saying to you is that the narrative within government is shifting. There is an understanding that any culture of non-payment is not acceptable in a democracy. And like we taught all of you in the 2000s, you've got to learn to pay for services now as well. And the Minister of Finance himself is very clear on this matter. So mechanics and how different departments in government relate to one another to concretize this proposition is something that we'll have to come back to you on. But the objective is fairly clear. And the message to all of our South Africans must be clear as well. If you can afford to pay, pay. We're not saying that if you are an indigent person in a municipality, you must pay. Indigent people are listed. They're entitled to the free basic services that government provides through the equitable share in the fiscal transfer, and that takes care of them. But if you can afford to pay, it is wrong for you not to pay. And you, as a consumer, that's the contribution you can make to ensure that our electricity system works better than it is working at the moment. Several questions relate to labor. We've been in touch with labor over the last year or so, on and off, on one basis or another. We have been in touch with them, with most of them recently as well, and we will continue to engage with labor at my level. And then ultimately it's at the Eskom management level, where some of the transacting and negotiating has to happen as well. But what we want is an agreement amongst coal producers, amongst our labor representatives, other stakeholders from communities and government, to understand that we need to take Eskom in a new direction and make it a sustainable entity. And each of us has a part to play in making a contribution, or we all lose out at the end of the day. So I think we are beginning to get some traction on that, and there are some narratives around privatization and so on, which is part of the fake news industry. As far as we are concerned, I've given you a clear articulation of where we stand, processes that we are involved in. So expect that the trolls will start working at some stage in this particular regard. But just read the paper first before you believe anything else in that particular instance. Paul, you asked about the Eskom Governance Act. I think all of what we are talking about is going to happen within the current legislative framework. And then we'll begin to look at how a legal transformation framework and where legislative changes are necessary, you'll get to hear about them, but they don't have to happen, I think, anywhere near the first quarter of next year as we stand today. What's the meaning of a special paper? Well, it's special. A white paper is not a green paper. It's a commitment that we are all concerned about Eskom. We need Eskom and we need a reliable electricity supply. So if you want to understand what we mean by a new business model, if you want to understand how of institutional changes that need to actually happen, let's spell it out for you in a paper. So that's the paper that you have before you. And this will then take on different forms as we go on within the government processes itself. So its status is a roadmap for the future, and as we get through each phase, where cabinet consent or whatever is required or legislative changes are required, we'll go through the normal processes that our Constitution requires of us to actually take. Yeah, the competition between different federations is healthy in a democracy. So let them compete. I think the key issue for us is whether you're competitors or not, we want to work with all of you. Whatever your background, whichever federation you belong to, if you have an interest in Eskom and you have an interest in the electricity industry, then you're an important stakeholder as far as we're concerned, and we want to engage with you, get your ideas. We'll amend things that need to be amended if need be. But let's talk and let's work in a constructive spirit, which is what we want at the end of the day. So, Carol, your point about clusters and so on, as I said, this is the beginnings of the have that, we'll be able to share that with yourselves and other constituencies as well. And the questions that you ask in this regard will all be addressed when we get into that detail. On the debt question, as I say, I defer to the Minister of Finance. Let him go through the MTBPS tomorrow, and if we jointly have to add any more clarity, we'll do so as we go forward. I don't think you have too much time more for questions now.
Take one question and one question. Sorry, I'm going to take 2 questions this side and 2 questions in Cape Town. But please stick to 1 question, please, guys. Sikonat, you have already.
Good day, Minister. Samuel Skiji from the Mail and Guardian. Sort of like a de-incentivization, of the labor force at Eskom, given everything else that you're going to be asking of labor within the plan itself. How do you envisage that sort of conversation going with the unions?
Last question, Diabo.
Minister, it's Diabo Sito from SABC News. My question is with regards to the MYPD methodology of NERSA. I see that you say that the country needs to develop a long-term price path to provide certainty to investors. What has been the conversation with regard to the fact that we're already sitting on a very high was the conversation with regard to the MYPD methodology of NERSA? Thank you.
Giselle, Cape Town, please. 2 last questions.
Richard, we've got our remaining 3 questions from our first round. So it's Marianne.
There's only 2.
Please.
Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon. It's Marianne Merton from Daily Maverick. Minister, perhaps you can shed some light on why it is you that is presenting the special paper on the eve of the MTBPS. The talk certainly from yourself and the ministry and the department also has been that this would be a presidential announcement. Also, in terms of some of the timeframes, you've set one deadline, March 2020, for the transmission entity. Can you on some of the other deadlines? Thank you.
Elaine Miles from Argus Media. Minister, I'm interested in the engagements with the 7 coal firms that are making 100% profit. I'm just wondering, why is Eskom paying these prices if it's not fair? And then, is it perhaps because there is now export demand for low-grade coal, which Eskom used to be able to get cheaply? If these coal suppliers do not agree to the prices that you want Eskom to pay them, what prevents them from taking the coal and to the export market instead? And also, Minister Mantashe mentioned a coal price index to ensure transparency and also to cap coal prices. Is that being considered still? And also, will Eskom continue to pursue the cost plus?
Hi, my name is Sam.
No, there's only 2 from Cape Town.
Okay, Giselle, we're going to close it because we have run out of time. We don't have any time. Can the minister just...
Sorry about that. We'll try and arrange another
Yeah.
interaction with some of you if you're interested, like Chris is.
We'll note that, Minister. We'll remember that should you ever need to be reminded.
Sure,
I know this is the elephant or the tiger debate, but we'll let you win.
No, you're welcome, long as it's free of charge. On the finance company, we'll undertake the necessary engagements with whomsoever we need to. I think the key is, as we've said before, that everything that we do to be publicly acceptable, and nobody should be at a tremendous advantage over anybody else in terms of the kind of benefits that accrue to people. And there has been an element of extravagance we have to look at, the details of which I'm still looking for. So don't see this as a negative thing. How many companies in South Africa make financing for homes available to managers, for example? That's you go to a bank and you get a loan, and that's the end of the story. And depending on your credit worthiness, you'll get the right interest rate for what you deserve. That's what most of you do. You don't have a special company to back you up. And then as far as the MYPD is concerned, that's a bridge we haven't come to yet. But I think what the main point we're making, whilst we take account of what you're saying, is if we're saying that MYPD is based on cost-reflective tariffs, what does cost mean? Can we break that cost down? And can we reduce that cost so that what emerges out of the calculation as cost reflective is on a lower cost base than we're currently talking about? And if that is a feasible thing to do, then we owe it to South Africans to do it. In other words, give them more reasonably priced energy, and certainly for the competitiveness of various sectors in our economy, particularly those that export, administered prices, which is electricity, freight charges, port charges, can't be at the level that they are. There are higher levels of efficiency that need to be brought in each of these sectors. So it's not just electricity we're talking about. And eventually there will be that conversation with Minister Mantashe and NERSA in that regard. Marianne, you asked some interesting questions, I must say. The President instructed me to release the paper today, and as a loyal cabinet member, I'm doing so. Announcements he wants to make later in the week, next week. As far as deadlines are concerned, once we have the more, at least you've got indicative deadlines in terms of what we want to try to actually achieve. On the coal side, yes, price indexing is what the Mineral Resources Department is working on, and that's what we will put on the table when we meet the coal producers as we get into the next step. On the cost-plus mines, I think Eskom has set aside some 20 billion rands or more to invest in cost-plus mines and get that cycle moving again. It doesn't have as much money as it should, but just for your information, ladies and gentlemen, those of you that are not familiar with this, Eskom power stations were always built close to or on top of a coal mine. And Eskom contributed to the capital cost of setting up the mine. And as a quid pro quo, or as a return favor, if you like, it got coal at a reduced price. Eskom helped, and in return, it got cheaper coal. What happened in the last couple of years is that the coal plus formula and relationship was destroyed, and now Eskom is attempting to start it again. So with that, we have a bright future for Eskom. It's still got a few clouds around it right now that we will clear up as part of crisis management, but I'm confident that if we get all the role players to work with government, we can have a different Eskom in the next 3 to 5 years as part of a longer-term journey. Thank you very much for being with us today.
You seem very clear. Thank you.
Thanks.